OBS is going. Beautiful. So the plan for this week is to talk about this puzzle. And I have to confess something. I genuinely think this might be one of my favorite philosophy articles ever. I fucking love it. It's so weird, but also wonderful, and it's about a really big puzzle, a really big problem that's been around for a long time. And it basically shows that everyone had been thinking about it in the wrong kind of way, which I think is awesome. And it does it through two very kind of almost silly thought experiments. So what I thought we could do is start off by doing some review, some naming and necessity review, so we're all kind of on board with the stuff we talked about last week, and then again, kind of reassess where it puts us, what the results from the naming and necessity stuff puts us. Then I want to talk about a kind of attitude context problem, or an objection that in fact we've run through once already. But it's an objection that was often raised to a particular view about how singular terms work. And then I want to talk about the paper, right? A puzzle about belief. And talk about the two cases that Kripke introduces that purport to show that actually the problem doesn't do the thing that everybody thought it did. In fact, it's a much bigger problem, and in that sense isn't an objection to any particular position. And the upshot of all that is going to kind of push us to then, like, so how in the hell do singular terms work after all? So that's the plan. Does anybody know who this is? This is Paderewski. We will come back to him. He had an amazing life. So he genuinely was a extremely famous, world famous pianist. Went on and founded a big conservatory support group thing in the U.S. Actually was one of the huge founders for modern Poland. He was the first prime minister of modern Poland, independent Poland. He signed the Treaty of Versailles for Poland, which is really cool. He's the one there's the Paderewski case. It's about him. So he is both a world-famous musician and possibly a world-famous politician. Very few people know that it is the same person in both cases. Really fun story. So, we're going to come back to him in probably about 40 or 50 minutes. Okay. So that's the plan. So first, to review, right, the key things to take away from the naming and necessity stuff. So one really huge idea, and probably, to be honest, the biggest one, is that proper names are rigid designators. So that is, a rigid designator is a term that picks out the same object in every world if it picks out anything at all. So proper names like Aristotle or Nathan or Paderewski, right, these rigidly designated objects. We pick on something and then we can track it across all possible situations. Either we'll know that it's here and it's got some properties, or we'll know, oh, it's just not around in this possible world. And the important thing to note, and I think we talked about this last time, is that it doesn't matter if in the other worlds they call that object by a different name. We're talking about the worlds, we're not talking in the worlds. So our use is rigid, even if it turns out that other people will call that object something different. Our idiolect is the one that matters for rigidity, at least for our perspective. Now, once you have this notion of rigid designation, we can quickly get a kind of split between three notions that, for a long time, people thought were basically the same. That is, the analytic, the a priori, and the necessary. We can get a posteriori necessities. This is when we learn that two names rigidly designate the same thing. And we can also get contingent a priori claims. So the example here was, suppose we name the stick that is in fact the meter stick, stick M. Well, it's contingent that stick M is 1 meter long. We could break into the vault and shave some bits off, or it might not be in a vacuum, so it might have expanded because of the heat, or contracted if it got cold. Right? So it's possible that this sentence is false, even though it's a priori, given that the meter stick is, by definition, the meter stick. And then the other big thing coming from naming and necessity were the three objections to descriptivism, where again, descriptivism is the view that every proper name functions by providing something like a description that an object satisfies. And the three objections all turn on pulling apart our ability to track an object from its descriptive content. So we have the knowledge argument, which is basically that people can use a name even if they don't have any definite description underpinning it. And so Joe can talk about Feynman even though he doesn't know enough to provide anything like a definite description. We had the modal argument, which was that, look, if you think about any particular object, it's not necessarily true that this object satisfies all the properties that are in its description, in its definite description. It could have been different, in which case we can still talk about the object, use the name, which is rigid, but satisfying the associated definite description need not be. The two can come apart modally. And then our third one, the really funny one, this is the one about Gödel Schmidt, right? Where what we had is this story about suppose that Gödel had in fact knifed some guy in an Austrian back alley and stolen his proof for the incompleteness of arithmetic. Based on that, it seems like whenever we talked about Gödel, we should have been referring to Schmidt, but says Kripke, this is wrong. In fact, we are still talking about Gödel when we use his name. In fact, you can even see it if you think about it, because we'd have to say something like, oh, it turns out Gödel isn't Gödel. Or Gödel is in fact Schmidt this whole time. It's not this guy. The way we would express it seems to fail. So the three arguments together put a lot of pressure on descriptivism. It seems like the epistemic, the metaphysical, and the semantic dimensions of a name and the associated definite description, it can come apart. That's a lot of pressure. So, okay. But of course, this seems to push us back to a view that we talked about in the very, very first lecture. This idea that names are just tags. That is, the meaning of a proper name is just its reference, and there isn't really any content about the thing that we're tagging that we learn. So this is a return to Millianism. So this is a quote that we had in lecture 1. But the nice thing is we don't just have this view that names are merely tags. Kripke also told us the story about the causal chain, where we baptize an object with a name. Shouldn't have moved it. Right. We're going to call this thing Steve. Right? My Coke bottle is Steve. We might use a description to help fix the reference, to help us tend to what we're talking about. But this isn't going to give you the meaning. The meaning is my boy Steve. The meaning just is the reference. But then everyone who's not here, present for that very auspicious baptism, can still use the name and refer to the same object because they'll stand in an appropriate causal chain to that baptism. You guys can tell them about the name Steve if you want. It's kind of weird. It's not exactly very helpful, but sure, go ahead. So this gives us the causal theory of reference. A particular use of a name is going to get to the right reference if you basically stand in the appropriate causal chain to the baptism. And once we have that kind of mechanism, we can pull apart or avoid some of the notions, some of the puzzles that we talked about. So that's the naming and necessity stuff in review. Super quick. Before we trundle on, I want to pause and ask, are there any questions on the naming and necessity, the Kripke stuff? Feel kind of okay about it? So if, say I asked you to describe one of these arguments in the exam, you'd be kind of okay? Good. That's probably going to be on there. All right. So where does this put us? Where does this put us? We basically spent like 4 weeks talking about singular terms, and I'm sure this is exactly what you guys wanted to do. But it's been fucking fun for me. Right? So we've really got kind of two options that we've been ostensibly developing. I threw you this sort of referentialism or millionism view right at the very beginning. With it, this is the idea that names don't really have anything like sense, meaning just as reference, right? The meaning of the name just is the object that it refers to. This is that quote from Mill, just sort of put into a view. And on the flip side, we have the descriptivist view. This is roughly what Frege and Russell bought into, and this is the idea that names have something like senses. Meaning is going to be the content, the description that's lurking behind the singular term. So the meaning of Aristotle is going to be the teacher of Alexander, who was the last student or the most famous student of Plato, blah, 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 blah. So those are the two kind of options. They're not the only ones, but they seem pretty damn close to the only ones. It's very hard to think of what other alternatives there could be. And when we think about issues with the kind of referentialism or millionism, two immediate problems come up. One is millionism seems to suggest you should always be able to substitute. To put it in Quine's phrase, it allows for substitution salva veritate. You can change co-referring names without ever changing the truth value of the embedded sentences. But this seems weird. It seems weird when we think about modal contexts, or at least first glance it might seem weird. And secondly, it certainly seems problematic when we think about attitude contexts. Remember, we talked about this. Lois believes that Superman can fly. Sure. Lois believes that Kent can fly. Not so much. Even if Kent is Superman. So we have to tell some story, and there doesn't seem to be a very good option for the million when we think about these kinds of substitution or attitude context puzzles. So in light of these two puzzles, especially this one, it seems to push us towards descriptivism. This referentialism, the flat, like names just denote and that's it, well, that doesn't seem quite right. It walks into these problems. Notably, Kripke gives us an answer, or at least a way for the million to respond to the modal thing. Cool, names are rigid designators. There's no problem with substitution. Similarly, Kripke's objections seem to just push directly against being a descriptivist. But there's still a big bad problem left. And the big bad problem is, what the hell do we say about attitude substitution? That Lois believes that Kent can fly. Lois doesn't believe that, Lois believes that Superman can fly. Lois doesn't believe that Kent can fly. How do we make sense of that kind of apparent failure of substitution? And in fact, Kripke even goes so far as to suggest that substitution's bound to fail because of the difference between an a priori identity claim and an a posteriori one. You shouldn't be able to change the epistemic access of something just because you change the word. Especially if it's a co-denoting word. That just doesn't seem right at all. So, yeah, this is sort of where we ended last lecture, right? Kripke's arguments seem to push us towards a sort of millionism. Whereas the problems we talked about, and in particular this sort of attitude problem, the substitution problem, seems to push us towards a descriptivism. And that seems to be one of the big lessons we learned from Frege. I mean, that was one of the reasons he said we needed sense. So that's sort of where we're at least with the run-up to this paper. But here's something kind of weird. Note the dialectic, right? We get the dialectic. What happens if it turns out that the attitude problem stuff, the substitution problem here, didn't have anything to do with millionism? that in fact, we could get the substitution problems independent of any view about how exactly singular terms work. Well, if that's the case, then it looks like the one big problem facing Millionism goes away. And it's important to kind of get why. As it's structured the way I was just talking you through it, this is a problem for these guys and not for those guys. It's a problem for the direct referential guys, the people who buy Mill's view, but not for Frege and Russell, etc. But if it turns out that the substitution thing can come up for anyone, and that it has nothing necessarily to do with how names work, but maybe with something like how believes that works, then it's not an objection anymore. At least not an objection to this view. It's an objection to something ancillary. Do we see the dialectic there? It's kind of an interesting one. I'm sure you've come up with this, you've come across this kind of case in other courses, right? But it's one where basically you say, oh, you raise this problem for me as if it's an objection for my view. But in fact, it's not due to my view. It's due to something else that we both accept. So this is no longer a problem for me. This is a problem for all of us. And it's no longer due to my view. It's due to something else. So the big cool trick in A Puzzle About Belief is Kripke's going to try and show that these substitution problems are entirely independent of whatever view we have about singular terms. To get it going, it's helpful to think about the typical version of the objection to Millionism. And the typical objection basically uses, sometimes they're put as 3 principles, we're just going to express it as 2, but we'll go through it. So we have one principle, which is a disquotational principle in English. And it says, look, if a normal English speaker reflectively and sincerely assents to some sentence P, then they believe it P. If they're not lying, and they've really thought about it, and they understand what the sentence says, if they assent to it, if they say, yeah, then they believe that sentence. Tilburg is in the Netherlands. Sure, I know what that sentence says. I understand it. I've got a pretty good grip on what all the fits mean. So yeah, I'm happy to say sure to that sentence. That means I believe that this place is in this bigger place. And it goes the other way too. If I believe that P, then on reflection, that speaker will sincerely assent to P. Again, there should be quotes around this one. This is just the other side of the coin, right? Basically, if they know the language and they understand what the sentences in the language say, then they'll say yeah to the sentences that they believe. That's not really shocking, right? So it's just a kind of relationship here between saying yes to something, saying yes to a sentence, and then buying whatever the sentence actually tells you. Now note, we can simplify this a little bit by moving to a general strengthened disquotational principle, because both of these were for English. I should say a speaker of English. So a normal, non-reticent speaker of some language L will be disposed to sincere reflectively assert P, if and only if they believe in P. Again, this is just a fancy way to package both of these together, right? Because here goes from the quote to the unquote. This should go from the unquoted to the quoted. Cool, then I can give you the directions in both. That's all this does. Gives you the biconditional. Now, one thing to note is because we're talking about language, because we have that use mentioned thing here, right, it's going to be relativized for each language. So you'll have to slot in a particular one. So there'll be one for Dutch, and French, and German, and English, and every other language you can think of. Which makes sense, because these are always going to be bits of language. They're going to be expressions. So we're going to use this principle, And we're going to use this principle. The last one here, which is that no logically competent person believes contradictory things. That is, if you believe P, you should also not believe that not P. Now this is heavy-handed. I think there's plenty of good people who, in fact, Graham Priest is a great example, who will push against this idea. But I think the kind of restricted principle that we can get away with here will be fine. The sort of cases that we're going to talk about maybe don't require quite this total a non-contradiction principle, but we can certainly get away with something like a restricted one. Restricted is the relevant ones we want to do. So let's run the argument. Here's the anti-million argument. 1. Lois assents to Superman can fly. We'll just take that as an assumption. Well, if that's true, then Lois believes that Superman can fly. That's just disquoting, right? Just taking the English sentence, let's suppose she understands, cool, she believes it. 3, another assumption. Lois assents to Clark can't fly, and or she doesn't assent to Clark can fly. Basically just double counting here, right? You see? She says, yeah, no, Clark can't fly. If that's true, then it seems, again, just from disquotation, Lois doesn't believe that Clark can fly. So far, so good, yeah. Now, here comes the kind of setup. Given millionism, Lois believes that Superman can fly if and only if she believes that Clark can fly. And the reason, the thought here, is that there's no difference in content between that sentence, Clark can fly, and that sentence, Superman can fly. So on millionism, she should believe one if she believes the other, and vice versa. But she doesn't. She believes one, and not the other. So this biconditional is false. So millionism must be false through a nice, straightforward modus tollens. Again, we've talked a little bit about this. We didn't quite put it in as flat and obvious these terms, but we talked about this basically at the end of the first lecture. So that's the kind of anti-million argument. Now here's Kripke's kind of inversion of it, or I'm not even sure we really call it an inversion, so much as just a way to play against it. Kripke's going to argue that this problem doesn't actually involve millionism. That is, it doesn't really require us having a particular view about how singular terms refer. In fact, all we need are these two, and we're going to get a contradiction. So here's our first one. This is just that same if and only if principle we had before. Right? A normal speaker of a language L who's not reticent will be disposed to sincerely reflectively assert P if and only if they believe the P. Basically, right, you'll say P if you believe the thing that P says. And here's our other principle. That's the translation principle. If a sentence of one language expresses a truth in that language, then any suitable translation of it into another language also expresses that same truth. The thought here is, right, it doesn't matter if this is quote P or if this is quote Q, whatever those express, that's the thing that they believe. The thing that is believed isn't kind of linguistically structured, it's some other kind of entity. It's not a sentence, it's some maybe fact or proposition or something like this. I think the translation principle is pretty hard to argue against, but we'll come back to it. Okay. So we're going to take these two, and we're going to generate the exact same contradiction. And when we do that, it's going to show that actually this argument didn't depend on millionism. This wasn't a problem for millions. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's Pierre. Does everyone know Pierre? You guys not played very much Stardew Valley? Oh my god, you're so far behind the times. So Pierre is the he runs a little bar kind of thing, a little shop actually, in Stardew Valley, and every Wednesday he closes the shop and goes to the bar because he needs to drink off the larger store crowding him out. He's also kind of a shitty character, so it is what it is. So let's talk about Pierre. Pierre, in our story that we're going to talk about, is a monolingual French speaker who lives in France. Doesn't matter where, you can pick anywhere you like. Pierre has heard of a distant famous city, and now we come to the fun part where I'm going to butcher some French, so forgive me. He's heard of a distant famous city, Londres. Based on the stories, Pierre is inclined to think that this city's pretty. Based on what everyone's told him about Londres, he's very happy to say, yeah, it's pretty. Of course, he doesn't say it in English. He says it in French because that's the only language he speaks. So Pierre is inclined to say this sentence, and I'm not quite up to the level to say this. But it's something like Londres est jolie. So he says that. He's happy to assent to that. So far, so good? Cool. Now things go a little bit pear-shaped for Pierre. One day, Pierre is bundled off by some human traffickers and is dumped off in the middle of nowhere, and he doesn't know where he is. But in fact, he's in a really ugly part of London. It's a pretty typical thing. Pierre ends up in London. He doesn't know that he's in London. He just knows he's in this place, nobody near him speaks French, and it's crappy. The streets are covered in garbage, the public transportation sucks, the beer is bad, right? The food is even worse. You see how this goes. The buildings are covered in soot. But he has to learn how to communicate. So he learns to communicate directly. That is, he learns to communicate in English, as it happens, by just mixing with people and doing the kind of thing that babies might do with learning language, where they slowly start to associate particular sounds with particular things, or particular ways of doing stuff. Notably, he doesn't learn English through translation. He doesn't learn English by like, oh, okay, what's the English word for this? Nah. What's the English word for this? Nah. Instead, he just picks it up on the go. Everyone who talks about the city that they all live in says how dirty and squalid and hideous and ugly it is. And of course, they're all speaking English. That's why he can't really communicate with them. So Pierre comes to believe, or at least comes to assent to, London is not pretty. The English sentence, London is not pretty. He's also similarly not at all inclined to assent to London is pretty. In fact, if he hears anyone saying this around him, he snorts, he flicks a cigarette at them, spits at them. You see how this goes. Right. You can see where we're going to go next. Right? So again, what's the setup? The setup was, before he was trundled off, he was very happy and inclined to say, Londres est jolie. Now that he's been trundled off and he's starting to pick up English directly, he's inclined to assent to London is not pretty. Or perhaps better, he's also not inclined to assent to London is pretty. So what do we have? Well, we have this as a kind of assumption from the story. We've got that he's very happy to assent to the French sentence. But if that's true, applying our translation principle and then disquotation, it follows that Pierre believes London is pretty. Similarly, he doesn't assent to London is pretty which given our generalized disquotation principle gives us that Pierre does not believe that London is pretty. So here's the really cool thing. We just generated the contradiction without ever saying anything about how referring to London works. We did it just by thinking about what would happen with two different languages. It doesn't matter whether we're descriptivists about how Londres or London works. It doesn't matter for Millian. We can get this same exact problem. The contradiction came up in the first 4 sentences of the objection, not the bit about the Millianism. So, what do we think? Do we see the problem? Do we see the issue? So maybe it's helpful to talk a little bit more about kind of summing it up. We've got a contradiction. Pierre believes that P, and it's not the case that Pierre believes that P. But we've also effectively mirrored that first 4 lines of the anti-Millian argument. To be really clear about the steps of the argument, to go from 1 to 2, what we need to do is, in French, use the disquotational principle, and we get this sentence, which I'm definitely not going to try and say. And then we use the translation principle to get us the relevant expression in English, the same proposition. And again, nothing here has to do with how any of the singular terms work. It all came about because of this principle, this disquotational principle, and translation. Let's go back, put them both on the board. Just these 2. That's all we needed. And that was enough to generate a contradiction. We did not need it to be a problem for Millianism. So, before we go on, again, pause. Yes?
I'm not sure, but this is also supposed to avoid the reference, the denotation theory.
Yeah, so it'll even kind of get around, or at least it shows that the problem here doesn't even come up if we have the descriptivist. Or maybe better, it comes in before the descriptivist machinery gets going.
Yeah, okay. Okay, but it's just the descriptivist theory and not the reference.
It applies to both.
But we at least have to accept that London and Londres have the same reference, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But if you think they don't have the same reference, you might have a very weird problem. Because it seems like Pierre could eventually learn that London is Londres. If you really think they're just different objects, something's weird when you're switching languages. You switch locations without moving. That doesn't seem quite right. Yeah. No, it's okay.
I just don't know if because they can also not be the same, because Londres is just like I get it kind of refers to London, but I just can't get over the fact that in his head it's just a made up city, and then that's also fine.
Well, good. So I think one of the things you can see, this is something we'll come back to. We'll come way at the very end. We'll come back to this. I think what you're pushing at is maybe something to go back even earlier than this. But yes, keep that thought. We'll come back to it.
Nice.
So again, the important thing to note, for what it's worth, is that he's using this term. So he's using the name to pick out whatever it's supposed to refer to. However it does, he doesn't really know or care. Right? He's just using it in the way that he's heard it, and the way that everyone around him, whenever they talk about Londres, does what it picks out. And he's saying, yeah, okay, cool. From what you've told me about it, it seems like that place is pretty. So from his perspective, he doesn't really know. I mean, he might be able to tell you all sorts of things about it in French. And interestingly, he might be able to say a bunch of things about it or assent to various things about it in French. that once he actually comes to live there, unbeknownst to him, he would deny. That's the trick. Is that it seems like he can assent to things in French, not assent to them in English, but they say the same thing. They express something like the same proposition. And if we think that that makes sense, we've got enough to run the argument. So I think one of the things that might be lurking here, and one of the ways we might push against this argument, is, again, note, to go from 1 to 2, we need to use both principles. So we needed to use the disquotational principle and the translation principle. Now, one of the things you might push against, and maybe this is kind of close to a worry, is you might think that this translation principle is too strong. To go back, here's the translation principle again, right? If a sentence of one language expresses a truth in that language, then any translation of it into another language also expresses that truth. And again, really, this should probably say any suitable translation, because there'll be bad ones. Or acceptable translation. So the thought with the translation principle is, right, if we really do have a good translation, whatever our French sentence is and whatever our English sentence is, they're expressing the same thing. And we might deny that. This is maybe kind of close? Not quite what you're after.
No, what I'm after just doesn't, I think just doesn't belong in this vessel.
That's not true.
What I'm after is more like just straight up not believing that there is a one thing.
Yeah.
And then I just don't know, like then it's fine to believe that, but it just doesn't belong to.
No. I think there's a version of something like that we're going to cycle back to. So, we might think this is the problem with this argument has to do with the translation principle. That was the thing that screwed it all up. So, let's run a version of the argument that doesn't use the translation principle. Let's come back to Paderewski. This is him later in life after he's become, I don't remember the official term, but basically the Prime Minister of Poland. Freshly independent Poland. So let's tell another story. And we're going to tell a story about Peter. And Peter he's got a passing interest in music and a passing interest in politics. So, he's not really invested in either, but he's got some interest in both. So, let's suppose that on one occasion, Peter listens to a record, a recording of someone playing piano, and it's a masterful performance, and he asks his friend, whose record it is, oh, who was that playing the piano? And the friend says, Paderewski. So Peter comes to learn that Paderewski is the name of a famous pianist. And more importantly, Peter would also come to assent to Paderewski has musical talent. Now let's suppose a few years later, Peter's kicking around with one of his friends, and his friend is telling him about this politician who's trying to help write the Treaty of Versailles, right? And Peter, he's a kind of weird guy. He doesn't trust politicians. He thinks they're useless, and they're useless about everything. So Peter comes to learn that there's this Paderewski guy who's a politician, and because of his beliefs about how crappy politicians are, Peter wouldn't assent to Paderewski has musical talent. Or alternatively, he would assent to Paderewski's useless. He doesn't even know how to play the piano. You'll note here, what we don't have is a difference in language. It's English the whole time. And in fact, even worse, it's the same name. So it's not like a case of difference. But you can see where this is going to go, what the next step is going to be. From the two bits that we mentioned, The first one, using disquotation, will give us that Peter believes Paderewski has musical talent. And the second one, again by mere disquotation, will give us that Peter does not believe that Paderewski has musical talent. In this case, we generated a contradiction, or at least a contradiction in beliefs, without using any translation. We did it all in whatever language Peter was talking. Yes?
How do we derive that he does not have musical talent from the fact that he's a politician?
Good. So here's the thought again. Peter's just a kind of odd guy,
Oh, yeah.
right? He thinks that politicians are completely useless,
Okay.
right? That's why they're politicians, man. They can't even get a job playing music or whatever, right? That's the thought.
Okay.
So he's got some kind of link to go from Paderewski as a politician to Paderewski has no musical talent. No, it's good. It's good. It's my fault for not making it clear. Yeah.
Does Peter know that it's the same guy?
No.
Okay.
That's the trick. He just knows that Paderewski names a famous pianist, and he knows that Paderewski names a politician. He doesn't know that they're the same names for the same person. But he should, because Paderewski's a priori. He doesn't need to be told anything to know that that identity statement's true. So he should know it. No one needs to tell him. That's why this version of the puzzle is fucking kick-ass, right? We don't need to do anything about translating, which we might be worried about. And right, if everything that the descriptivists have told us about identity statements are true, he should just know it automatically. Because it's Paderewski. This dude's this dude. So yeah, here's the cool thing. It looks like mere disquotation was enough to generate the contradiction. We didn't have to say anything about how Paderewski works, the name. It could be a description, it could be million, doesn't matter. We can get this apparent contradiction in what he believes. So the upshot of these two cases seems to be that the substitution problems, these kind of attitude substitution issues, have nothing to do with millionism. They come in before you say anything at all about how singular terms work. They're a product of disquotation, and disquotation alone. Like if we buy the Paderewski version, that only used, the only thing we needed to run this argument is that general disquotation principle. And you can see it. You can even see how and why it's a problem before we have any sort of story. Because think about how we would try and report Peter's Paderewski beliefs on Frege's account. Presumably, Frege would have to tell us there's one sense. Let's go back a few slides, or one slide. Frege would have to tell us there's one sense associated with the first use of Paderewski, and there's a distinct sense associated with the second Paderewski. That's bad, because now we even have cases where we have the same name on either side of an identity claim, and it's a posteriori, and it's synthetic. And if that's what we have to lean into, then our whole story has just gone crazy. The mechanism that's supposed to tell us how we learned something when we learned that A equals B is now telling us we're learning something when A equals A. And that's not so good. So that's a really cool puzzle. I think it's genuinely just such a cool puzzle. I'm curious to hear. I mean, first thing first, do we understand the sort of structure of both of the two puzzles? So we have Pierre, which involves using the translation, and we have Peter, which just involves, if you like, a temporal gap or some ignorance about two instances of the very same name. We think we got a grip on the puzzles, how they work. What do we think? Are we moved by the puzzles?
Yeah, but I'm still stuck with the trade part.
Yeah.
Because I maybe wouldn't agree that you say A is A if you say Tadeusz, the politician is, yeah, but I was thinking about, for instance, names that of words that have two different meanings depending on the context. But I could only think of a Dutch example.
Bank is a good one.
Okay, yeah. So a bank, but when you say bank is bank, okay, yeah, okay, but the sense of the bank in one case is not the same as the sense of the bank but I don't really see the problem since when you talk about senses, you say a, or the, yeah, I'm just a bit stuck.
No, I think this is a good worry. I think it's a good thing to be stuck on, right? So here's the trick. If there's a difference in sense, what are the different senses? And to push that even further, why is it that there's different senses in this case, and why are there the same senses in any other identity claim, and we have the same name on both sides? If the response is, oh, because it's a posteriori in this case and a priori in the others, that's cart before the horse. The similarity of senses was supposed to explain, not be explained by, the a prioriness. So there are moves to make. The trick is going to be making the move, right? How to actually cash it out. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm also just not here with my head today, so I don't really know if.
Me too.
But I don't really get how, like, for me the part where Peter said, like, yeah, he's a politician, so he can be a musician. Like that seems false to me. That seems like if I would make an argument and say there's this guy who believes that this is a cell phone, and then the next one would be, but he also believes that that it's not a cell phone or something.
Sure.
Like there's something in the argumentation where I just say like, yeah, but like nobody would actually do that.
Yeah.
And also, it's not to me like, so it just seems like the argumentation goes wrong to me there. So can you maybe explain that?
Yeah, no, I think this is good. So part of this is making it fit Kripke's slightly silly example. But you might get it a different way, right? So you might come across a name at one point. You might hear of Amanda and know of her as, like, she's a philosopher in the department here. Or you might hear Amanda as Nathan's partner. And you might not know that they're the very same person. So you might assent to certain things under one use of the name, and not assent to uses to sentences under other uses of the name. But the problem is they refer to the very same thing. That's the trick here. So don't get hung up on the particular example case. Just if you can think of any cases like that, where you've heard a name in one context, and the same name in a different context, and you don't know that they pick out the same thing, and you say yes in one case, and you wouldn't say yes to something in the other case. That's all we need. This is just a very funny, silly version.
Yeah, then I think I get it, but I just then really don't care or something.
Well,
so,
no.
But I'm just like, yeah, okay.
So here's again to remember, recall the dialectic. Why it's meant to be like an issue, right? Is the sort of dialectical situation was, all right, we're kind of torn between this million story and a descriptivist story. And the stuff against the descriptivist are like Kripke's objections. The stuff against the million, well, really it kind of boils down to, what are we going to say about these belief cases? It's much the same with, how can identity statements be informative? Those two puzzles we started with way back.
Yeah. I think it just doesn't.
That's okay. That's okay. So again, the dialectic is, what do we say about these? And Kripke's response is, that's not my problem. That's our problem. So it's not an objection to this view, It's just a weird issue that happens with disquotation. It's a problem about belief. It's not a problem about singular terms. That's why it's a puzzle about belief. And note, the same thing could be done if we didn't like belief. We could do it with hopes that, or knows that, or thinks that. All of these kind of work. All these broadly intentional verbs that take a that clause are going to give us a version of this puzzle. All we need is just to be able to talk about the same thing using the same name in two different contexts, and we're good to go. Okay. So we've been going for about 50 minutes. I know we said break, but I've got maybe 10 minutes of content left, and then I figured we could talk about stuff. So do we want to take a break and then come back, or should we just push through and aim and end early?
Just push through. No, I say like 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
That's fine.
Minutes is fine.
We can do a 5-minute break and then we'll come back. We'll still probably end very early. Don't worry. So one thing I wanted to mention, that's probably going to be terrifying for anyone listening to the recording because it just totally had a long gap. I wanted to mention two the kind of pushbacks in the puzzle that were raised in the break because I think they're both really nice, and both of them kind of help to sharpen the puzzle. So in particular, there were kind of pushbacks to this Peter Paderewski version, but we can also see them as instances against the kind of Pierre one. So one idea was that what's happening here is that Paderewski is something like a kind of incomplete name. A really nice example with Young, I think that's a good one, right? Lewandowski is another one. I think there's a Lewandowski who's a conductor, right? And obviously a footballer, right? So here's one thought. Maybe we can resolve the puzzle by saying that, well, look, there's a possibility of natural language names referring to different objects. You could have the same name, but it picks up different objects. And what's really the problem here is that. So if we eliminated that and made sure that every object only had one name, then we could block this. Of course, that's true. We would block this puzzle. But then we would never have the substitution puzzle. Because remember, the substitution puzzle relies on one object having multiple names. Superman and Clark Kent, something like this. So if we rarefy the names in such a way that they only pick out one thing, only ever pick out one thing, then we avoid the puzzle, but at the cost of just not lining up with how natural language works. Yeah.
Can we also say that like there's a difference between one object having multiple names and multiple names? Then one object having multiple names, and that one name can have multiple. That's like a difference, right? That's not. So then you can also bring that in, right?
So what we would need though then is again a way to tell when it's going one way and when it's going the other. And why I couldn't just say, oh, these are different names.
Yeah.
They're like grammatically identical, but like that's just one thing. They happen to be written with the same symbols and they're pronounced the same way, but they're different names because they pick up different things. It looks like we'd either have to build it in at the level, literally, of the syntax somehow, like we did with formal logic, right? Where whenever we had different lowercase letters, it was guaranteed that they picked out different objects. But there we did it with the very language itself was doing the semantic work for us. That would be a big move, and that would take us well away from how natural language works. The other kind of objection, which I thought was a really good one, both of them are really nice, is what we have is kind of two definite descriptions associated with the occurrences of the name. So there's something like description 1 associated with this, maybe brought about by, say, salience and context, or something like this. And it features musical talent, being a pianist, etc., etc. And then there's a different definite description, B2, that's associated with the occurrence of the name in these other contexts, these political contexts. And so Peter's kind of failure here is just not knowing the two definite descriptions code in those. And it's understandable, and then we can kind of get around the case. The trick here, I think, is going to be trying to figure out if we just say, like, something like that, is this a priori or a posteriori? Which descriptions am I associating with the name here? In effect, it's trying to kind of push to say, well, we need to build the description, maybe better. We need to make the description just sort of fall out of the occurrence of the name. And it looks like we can't. It looks like we should be able to say, this is a priori. Or that I could correct. If you said, oh, you're telling me something about the musician and the politician. It's like, no. I was saying the politician is the politician. Really? You think maybe you could have helped me out here? So one of the things that's kind of coming through, I hope, is natural language is really, really, really messy. So let's talk a little bit about that. This is kind of bringing the stuff we've done for the last 4.5-ish weeks together. So we have a kind of dilemma, right? We have this story that we got from Mill, mentioned in the first lecture, and has been defended or at least advanced by Kripke, that names are just tags, right? They don't tell you anything descriptive about the object. And the meaning of a singular term, a name, just as its reference. But this immediately walks into the opening puzzles. How do we make sense of talk of apparent non-existence? How do we make sense of negative existentials? What are we going to say about these substitution cases? And what do we say about informative identity statements? Now, maybe what Kripke's just talked us through says, hey, the substitution puzzle thing, that's not a big deal. That's not a problem for these guys per se. It's about belief. But the other ones are still there. Right? There's certainly nothing that they've told us so far that has anything about apparent talk of non-existence or negative existentials. So there's still a bunch of issues. On the flip side, you might think names are something like descriptions, either because they convey senses or because they're just concealed definite descriptions. And this might give us ways to deal with the four puzzles we started with, but they walk immediately into Kripke's objections, which seem to pull apart the use of the name from the relevant embedded descriptive content. So where do we end up? Put really bluntly, I mean, all the options suck, right? We could go names are just tags, and then we have problems. We can go names or descriptions, and then we have problems. And there's a couple of things we might do here. And these were our original puzzles, just as a reminder. So one thing we could do is, let's go all the way back to the very, very first view that we talked about. Does anyone remember the very first view we talked about how language works? A sort of idealistic view, I think I called it, or an ideal view. Now that could be an option, and I think this isn't too terribly far away from the sort of view you were talking about. Right? Maybe the big issue here has been that the whole time we're trying to go through language to something like propositions or the reference, and we think that there is a single kind of thing that they're going to. That's a move, and I think that could be a response to some of these cases. I think the big issue with that kind of view is going to be the one we had before, as to how to then make sense of same. How is it, if we have everybody's language picking out different things, how is it that we can meet? That's going to be the trick here. That was a big challenge. Another way we can go is, well, we can just plump for one of the two options. To go back a step, we can dig our heels in and be like, no. Names really do just, that the meaning is just how they refer. And that's it. Or go with the descriptivism stuff, again. And then we find ways to deal with these objections. Find ways to solve the problems. A last really weird option, and this is kind of the opposite of the move to the idealist, is we can say, look, all of these come up because we're talking about natural language. English, Dutch, etc. And natural language is a mess. If we learned anything, we've learned that this stuff is a complete disaster. Even the purportedly simplest parts of this thing, semantically, are just nightmares. Even names, just names, those should be easy. These are the simplest fucking parts of this language. And yet, who the hell knows how they work? So maybe the problem here is natural language. This was a view that basically Russell seemed to be suggesting. And in fact, it was in the Frege too. So we can think back on Russell's response to Strawson. Strawson says, look, if we really think about how people in natural language respond to the present King of France's fall, they're not going to say that's false. They're going to say, what the hell are you talking about? And Russell's rebuttal was, yeah, sure, maybe that's how natural language works, but I want a language that's actually connected to reality. I think that means we have to adopt something that doesn't have any gaps and gluts, say. So one move is we could just say, these are problems for natural language, but that's because natural language is broken. We should move to a more perfect language, say. Now that's let me just say, that is a massive move. And I think the big issue with this is baby with bathwater. Does everyone know what I mean with that idiom? No. So you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You're dumping the bathwater because it's cold, but the baby's still in there. So you're getting rid of the good stuff while trying to get rid of the bad stuff. That's a massive overreaction. It might avoid a bunch of these problems by giving up on natural language. But here's the trick. That's what we fucking talk in. And it's what we've been doing philosophy in. Even Russell, with his high and mighty, we should use formal language to track everything, still conveys most of his stuff in natural language. Or to put it in an even blunter way, and this will be something that's again going to maybe trigger some bad flashbacks for people. If we think about how we formulate our formal languages, we use natural language as the meta-language. We talk about the formal languages in things like English. So if we want to actually get to these lovely, rigidified, grammatically pure formal languages, we're probably going to have to get there through this trash. So any of the problems that we might have apparently dealt with, we're doing so by just ignoring what happens at one level up. This is not meant to be doom and gloom, right? This isn't like there's no good story to tell here. Well, let me say better. This is doom and gloom in the sense that there's no good story to tell here, at least not an obvious one. But that's why it's fun, right? Because if it was obvious, then what the hell would we have done for the last 4 weeks, right? It's been like, here's a slide, the answer's solved, let's go home. What's interesting is that there's lots of options here, and the options all have their own little senses in which they're attractive, and they all have their own little negatives. And you might think that one of the things we do as philosophers is something like, let's tally up the negatives and the positives of the views and then come out with the one that's best. This one isn't perfect, but, I think that the net positives outweigh the net negatives. It isn't really clear how to resolve all the tensions that these accounts face to give us a single unified theory, but maybe that's okay. Maybe no single unified theory is going to resolve every problem. But the big upshot, I guess, in the last 4 weeks is really that with singular terms, these purported the simplest part of the language, even figuring that out, leads to really weird and difficult challenges. And these are really difficult and puzzling challenges that still form, not quite as much as they used to, a core of what's philosophy of language. So that's one of the reasons why we've been talking about it. Okay. So before we go on or anything, I guess what I wanted to do was to kind of see a couple things. I guess one, what do people think of that dialectic? So we have these kind of, there's the descriptivist, and we have reasons to kind of pull either way. Do we think that's a good dialectic description here? Do we have inclinations one way or the other? What do we think about the various puzzles and problems we've talked about? Yeah.
Personally, I tend to the major descriptions interpretation more, because in the example of Londres and London, I would say that description of Londres is different than that of London. So, and it has also a different reference.
Ooh. Why do you think it has a different reference?
Yeah, I think so, because one is the idea of just one idea that of a city that you've come to learn through discourse, and the other one is the experience of specific streets and places. And
do you ever use a map?
I do.
How? One's a representation, one's a place.
Right, but then you believe that the map represents that specific place, but for Pierre, Londres is not the same as London.
So as soon as we believe it, they denote, they co-denote, and they don't beforehand. I mean, if we think this, right, then we'll never. We should. I mean, do you see the kind of push here, right?
Yeah. I mean, they in a sort of abstract way, they might denote the same thing. Perhaps not in a specific.
I guess so. Here's a worry. It seems like then there should be 3 different things in Pierre's head, or 3 different things going on here. There's Londres, the idea. There's London, the idea. And then there's the physical place that he's walking around. So why does London pick out the place that he's in, the physical place that he's in, rather than the idea? The English idea, the dirty idea. Does that make sense?
Because people throw in that the streets he's walking in now are London. Yeah, and I think as soon as somebody tells me, hey, the Londres thing you were thought about, that's actually also me.
That's here.
Then the whole problem is solved.
Good.
Because at that point, he doesn't think of Londres anymore as a beautiful city.
Good.
The whole point to me is that, like, as just basically as a human, these problems won't arise, and as soon as somebody makes out to you that there's a problem, it gets fixed.
Well, so this is the issue, right? Again, we can find ways to sort of fill in additional beliefs that will avoid the contradiction. As soon as we tell him, oh, look, Londres is London, he'll be like, oh, right, I guess I was wrong earlier.
Yeah.
But until then, it looks like he's got to have contradictory beliefs.
Yeah, but
that's not the same thing.
But at that point, it's not the same thing to me.
Take the Ananda case.
The thing is, I get that, like, it's the same thing, but to me, like, all these problems come from just someone misunderstanding, and not from, like, a logical, and I just don't believe that people are so naturally logical that they won't ever, and I also don't believe that that's in language. I just think that people are just kind of stupid sometimes.
That's certainly true.
So then these things just happen, right?
But I guess if we think about, like, Seinfeld was so good at this. So Seinfeld would have whole episodes basically driven by something like this kind of a puzzle. People would be talking past each other and not realize they're talking about the same person or place. And then at the very end, they'd be like, oh shit, no, that was the same place the whole time. And I guess the thing it's very hard to square is how they could say it was the same place the whole time. Especially if we buy this idea that what it denoted in the first place was the idea. Like, up until they were told this.
Yeah, but
Oh, good, it's okay.
yeah, to me, like, it was not the same place at the time they were talking. And as soon as they find out, like, oh, actually we don't know the same thing, and it's just at that point in space and time
Sure.
that this becomes true. But before that, it's just
Yeah, I guess.
different opinions to me.
Well, I guess so. Frege has another nice case about this, and it's about God. I think it's Kilimanjaro. I forget exactly which mountain it is, but you had two explorers who had drawn two maps, and they were maps of the same place, but they had labeled the mountain different names. And then someone looked at the maps and was like, "Oh, these are the same mountain. They both represent the same mountain." But importantly, again, the thing that was kind of driving it and what allowed them to say these represent the same mountain was the thought that these representations were always getting us to the representations of the same place. If we kind of fall back to this, like, it's just the idea, and it was always the idea until we're told the identity. I guess one worry is, what happens if we're told a false identity and we believe it? It doesn't seem like the result should then be that the names co-refer. It seems like it'd still be wrong. So it looks like what we need is a true identity. We need to believe a true identity. But then we're already in a problem, because we need them to co-denote to get us to the thing that's supposed to get us to co-denote. Do we see the move there? That was quick. Let me go through it. So we have A. I'm going to set this off real quick and turn this around so we can show my beautiful little scribblings. So let's take two examples. I use the generalized ones just because I find them really helpful. If you like particular examples, right, just use Alfred is I don't know, Paul, and Alfred is tall, yeah, whatever. Alfred is ooh, then the less right. So in this case, right, what's left open is, or at least it's still undecided, whether we're talking about the same thing. And then Nathan, being an asshole, tells you, oh, they're identical. But I'm lying. It seems like if we really had the kind of, if we follow the identity, or sorry, the reference is an idea to its limit, it seems like if I told you the lie and you believed it, then this would come out true, in a way? But that doesn't seem right. Well, so here was the thought of why, right? Because I took the view to be, they're different objects, they don't denote until we're told the identity and we believe it. But it's not just the believing. Because if it was just the believing, you could believe a false one and then make them co-refer. And I would think that what you have to do is not just believe the identity claim, but believe a true identity. Does that make sense? And then we're into, like, we already have to have the co-denoting before we have the belief. Because the belief is again, it's kind of cart horse thing. It's the truth of this identity that explains why this is a good belief. I think. Does that make sense to people? The kind of thought there? I think the kind of, they're distinct is a really attractive view. And it's hard to kind of suss out, if you don't buy it, what's at issue there. because it is really effective. But I think this might be a way to kind of go. Again, mere believing the identity isn't going to be sufficient. You have to believe true ones, but then you already have to have the true identities out there for you to get. But no, that's good. I think again, what this is pushing or suggesting is something like a reversion to that kind of idealistic theory. And effectively, what the kind of move I was just making is something very similar to that communication argument. It's like, if we want to track the judgments, then it looks like we already have to have something like existing facts out there for us to then pull in and use. But I'm not sure. I'm sure there's ways to push back on that. So, yeah, to kind of generalize back again, we have this so far, the 4 weeks, we've just been talking really about what's going on with these kinds of terms. How do these work? The two extreme options have pretty clearly failed us. The flat Newtonianism has failed us. It makes no sense when we do things like cool, what the hell does this say? On the Millian program, this is nothing. It can't say anything, or at least it's not obvious as to how. And on the descriptivist view, again, depending on how far you buy the Kripke objections, those seem to be problematic. Those seem to be really hard. So where to go? I don't know. I genuinely don't. I don't really have a good. I don't think there is a good option. They all have pretty massive flaws. One thing maybe that's worth asking is, what do we think about other options? Are there any alternatives that we might adopt? So I think maybe the kind of reversion to the idealist move is an option. But what else might we try? So again, the kind of central question is, that could be a move. That could be a move. Like, if we think that truth isn't substantive, I think that what we might be able to do is get versions of this back just by having a kind of very flat-footed disquotational notion of truth. And that's still going to lead to a kind of a version of this problem. So we don't have to have a substantive notion of truth and falsehood. Just think about, would you assent to this sentence? Would you not assent to this sentence? And then we'll get the same kinds of things. That's sort of one of the reasons why the belief puzzle was phrased in those terms.
But if that's true, then you go through the false. Because somebody can assent to it.
Sure. We might, yeah, and then we'll have additional maybe constraints.
And then nothing is a problem.
Potentially. But note, even on that kind of view, it's still very weird as to how to make sense of these kinds of places.
Yeah, I would say that. It's the same as we said about Landry being like an object in space in between people, just communicate without there being a. That's also fine.
Yeah, so this is very close to the kind of to the Phrygian sense story. Because again, a very unhelpful terminology of calling it the third realm. But they're meant to be abstract objects. And if we think that the meanings or whatever was going on here are abstractive, that's a perfectly good view. The trick now is going to be, which ones are they? How do we make sure our words are lining up to the right abstraction? How are we not slipping off?
Yeah, because the thing that Russell tried to move away from natural language, which I think, even though I think it's an ambitious project, I can only cheer for him. But I just find it ironic that moment we conclude Russell's theory, you still ask him, so does that make sense? And then all of a sudden we all know what it means and we do not have to avoid it. So yeah, that's just problematic.
Yeah.
Because sense, but is sense, did Frege take it? Yeah, it was in German, but
Yes.
the whole thing is sense and sin were words before Frege analyzed them. So I just find that
So I think the idea here is that we can, so even in scientific discourse, especially in scientific discourse, you can use a pre-existing term and say, I'm going to use this in a new way. So I'm going to have this same string of symbols, but I'm going to make it a technical term, and in my technical term, it's going to be this. So for Frege, this notion of sin, right, sense, as it's translated, we're going to steal some of the kind of things that were already around, but of course he wants to introduce it as a purely technical term to pick out these weird abstract objects that are the meanings of the various constituent expressions of sense. Actually, this kind of highlights an option that I'm half surprised people didn't suggest, which is maybe this project was doomed to failure because what we were doing was looking at particular parts of language. So way back at the very beginning, when we talked about Frege on sense and reference, I told you that Frege's older view, right, the one that he had in his views about philosophy of logic and philosophy of maths, he had this view about compositionality. So the meaning of a sentence is composed of the meaning of its constituent parts. But he also had a kind of flip view. Do you remember the flip view? So this was what's called the context principle. Is it makes no sense to ask for the meaning of a particular part of language outside of its use in sentences, in whole expressions. So maybe what was really the problem here is that we kept trying to ask about the meaning of singular terms in some kind of context-independent way. So we shouldn't have been asking questions like, how does a singular term refer? The better question is to ask, how is this kind of expression used in various contexts? And then, of course, there's a sensibleness there. But that you might think that's just moving the ball on the carpet. Because now we want to know, right, cool, you've asked me how it's used in sentential context, but how does this get its meaning? And this is a problem if we also buy that kind of compositionality principle, because again, we need to tell them how the parts have meaning to give the meaning to the whole. But maybe we drop that. I think it's worth genuinely stopping and thinking about some of the different ways. But, okay. So, yeah. I think that's pretty good. What I wanted to really stress, and what I hope has kind of come through, is we started off with this, which should have been fairly simple. Like, how do singular terms, what do they mean? What's the meaning of a given name? And there are some very natural views, and some slightly more awkward views that we've gotten, all of which have their benefits, and all of which have their negatives, and it isn't really clear what to do. And I think that's interesting. It's fascinating to me that some of the best minds in analytic philosophy have really struggled with this and just come up with stuff that at least sounds okay at first glance and then immediately runs into some big fucking problems. So, yeah. So the plan now, and I hope this was interesting. I hope this is fascinating. Again, this is the kind of stuff I fucking love. So I hope this at least been vaguely entertaining, if not outright interesting. Let me turn this back on and see how it goes. I don't even know what slide it's on now. So what we're going to do next is we're going to pivot quite hard. And we're going to pivot quite hard in a way that kind of follows the stuff I was saying right at the end. So instead of focusing on the meanings or, the semantic content of particular parts of sentences or expressions, we're instead going to think about expressions taken as a whole. So the plan for next time is to read some stuff and think about speech act theory. Are you guys familiar with this? Have you done this in other things? So we've actually got 2 readings for next week, and let me say some things about them. One of them is from an Introduction to Philosophy of Language book. I think that's going to be pretty easy going. This is basically just covering the idea of what speech act theory is and how it works. I'm just going to put this really bluntly to you. A lot of the details are kind of boring. It's Austin doing thousands of different distinctions in natural language, and most of them are. But it's important to get the basics. And then the other thing I want to talk about is a particular application of speech act theory. So this is Ray Langton using speech act theory to do some feminist philosophy, to talk about pornography as a kind of speech act. So I would really suggest reading both. If you don't have time to read both, just go through the Langton and skim the other thing. I'll talk a lot about this. I'd like to have some time for us to talk through Langton's argument and how it relies upon the speech act material stuff. As I mentioned, I'm going to post some sample exam questions on the weekend. I'll also post some suggested essay topics. Let me stress again, the essays do not need to be very long. I just want you to kind of familiarize yourself with some of the arguments, because that's what will be on the exam. Okay, cool? Thanks for coming, guys. Have a lovely week, and I'll see you all next Tuesday.